Like many people, I've made the pilgrimage to Burma in recent months, in November last year, as part of a group with the Global Alliance for Vaccinations and Immunisations, and they took a group of Australian and New Zealand politicians over to look at the vaccination and the rollout of a new vaccine program in Burma. And so we spent most of our time in Naypyidaw and then in townships outside Naypyidaw. It was very interesting. The reaction of the politicians to Naypyidaw was, as we drove up the 16-lane highways, was, "Oh, it's just like Canberra," and some lamenting of another planning disaster in the making, like Canberra. Interestingly, we met with the Health Minister 3 times, and I want to come back to that, but that's, even though the Health Minister is a paediatrician and so had a big interest in the vaccination program, it highlights a problem at the moment that perhaps both culturally, it's for people in Burma, it's when you have guests coming, it's a very respectful thing to meet with them. But I think it highlights a big problem that with the cavalcade of donors, business people, embassies, politicians, rock stars, universities, NGOs, and let's face it, carpetbaggers and snake oil merchants all coming in at the moment, it's very hard for Burmese government and for NGOs, civil society, to discriminate about what is worth spending their time on, and the opportunity costs for particularly government officials as they go from one meeting to another at the expense of actually getting on and implementing some of the plans that they're developing and using some of the new resources that have been allocated are actually, it's immensely challenging. So one of the places we visited was a township hospital, which was very decrepit. There were significant problems with treatment of people that we witnessed while we were in the hospital. And the hospital had been built in 1954, and I could say fairly didn't seem to have had much maintenance done to it beyond replacing the corrugated iron roof since 1954. That hospital would have been built at a time of national planning, the Pidortha plan, which basically was an initiative of the Burmese government of UNU in the early 50s and roughly meant prosperous land. And the plan had a number of features, but one of it included lots of consultation down to the community and township level about what people wanted in terms of their national development. Now, allowing for the fact that in the 1950s much of the country was beset with civil war, that consultation may not have been particularly extensive, but there's an interesting parallel with the modern phase of planning, which has been a continuum really since the 1950s to the current opening up of Burma, that the new series of national planning, such as the National Comprehensive Development Plan, are both top-down but also bottom-up, and also envisage consultation at the township level, as Sonanda Lin mentioned. And I think that's very, very important and significant as you allow both government officials, that elaborate typology or hierarchy of layers of government that Mike showed, as well as civil society, have input into the vision for the future at a local level, but also at a regional and national level, and particularly in the ethnic areas, it's going to be critical. The framework for economic social reforms that Sonanda Lin mentioned has a number of very ambitious targets, but just to mention those targets, one is to lift Burma from least developed country status by 2020 to a medium income country. So that would mean moving from 149 out of 186 countries, which is the status of Burma at the moment, into the 130s. So moving up about 10 or 12 spots, but that is achievable, but it depends on the other targets in that framework, such as nearly 8% growth rates per annum, an industry share of GDP, so a shift from government ownership to industry rising from 26% to 32%, and per capita GDP growth of 34%. So very ambitious growth targets. And there's been I'm not an expert in Burma, but I share the same expertise as you all do. I use Google, and there's a very interesting new report that's just come out last week about foreign aid and the challenges for national development planning. It's by two chaps called Lex Rifle and James Fox. And they have a fairly ideological sort of pro-market viewpoint to begin with, but they basically say that there's a triple transition occurring in Burma of social, political and economic change. And they list 8 challenges to the process of national development. The first is the peace process. Without peace, there can be no development, and the ongoing conflict in Kachin State, the outbreaks of violence in Rakhine State threaten the national development project. And unless there is a stake in the development process from the many dozens of Burmese ethnic minorities and wanting to participate in the building of a newly reformed state, it threatens the development plans and the alleviation of poverty. The second is the political system. The constitution, which is military dominated, and the checks and balances that are put into it but are sort of fluid and evolving, they just make observations from other states that this type of constitution has led to dysfunctional government in other contexts. Thirdly, macroeconomic policies. There needs to be a lot of stability in the macroeconomic situation around having balanced budgets, low inflation and an undervalued exchange rate. And so Nandalin explained some of the measures and steps that have been put in place to try and achieve that. But there's still real challenges there, and they suggest that multi-party political system, and indeed this is where they're quite ideological, and they observe that in Asia, the history of Asia and economic development over the past half century has actually been where authoritarian states actually lead very fast rates of economic growth for several decades and then liberalise the political system. And in the case of Burma, we've got a different situation where we're actually moving to a political liberalisation at the same time as we're trying to economic liberalise. And they put a question mark whether this is achievable, and it's out of step with the development models we've seen in Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea and Taiwan, etc. Private capital flows are actually going to vastly outstrip aid flows. Once investors get a sufficient sense of a stable legal environment, there promises to be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars worth of investment going into Burma looking for returns. And that can have a whole range of effects, from not just from ranging from upsetting cultural sensitivities, exacerbating corruption, and basically could jeopardise economic development. There's an Australian economist called Jared Bissingham who's done some very good analysis on Burma, why it will not become a new Asian tiger. And I suggest you look at it, but basically he's suggesting that the focus on natural resource extraction is a heavy liability. There's not an indication that investment's going to go into productive manufacturing, for example, or agriculture, where 70% of the population live. Other challenges, and this is the fifth area they identify around resource extraction, is just slowing the rate of extractive resource extraction. It's very rapid in deforestation, mining, etc. It inflates the exchange rate, making other manufacturing products exports uncompetitive, and investing the money, the profits from resource extraction in a way that brings benefits for future generations is going to be an urgent need. So the types of sovereign wealth funds we've seen set up for Timor-Leste would be perhaps a good model here. 6, land grabbing, and if any of you have seen the recent show on SBS that exposed this and have followed it, I mean, this is going to be a massive issue, and unfortunately there are not a lot of good models around the world on how to deal successfully with land grabs. But it's going to need all the ingenuity of the new political leaders in Burma to try and manage this. And it's interesting that Aung San Suu Kyi's recommendations in the inquiry that she's led into the recent incident around the mine site, her recommendations are actually for better police training, and that the mining company still has the right to operate. What's been lacking is the social licence to operate. I've mentioned agricultural development, but basically given the high proportion of people living in the rural areas, there's an urgent need to raise income in in the agricultural sector, and finally in education. The system, as Joseph has just indicated, has been very, very run down, so there's urgent need for investment. So what does aid have to do with all this, and how can aid help? There are a number of new processes and systems that have been set up by the government of Burma to help manage aid. As you can imagine, Burma is having lots and lots of consultations with donors about the sectors to invest in. The government has set up in June last year a Foreign Aid Management Central Committee, which is chaired by the President, 2 Vice Presidents and 26 Cabinet Ministers, so it's very high level. And underneath that sits a Foreign Aid and Grant Management Committee, which is chaired by the former Ministry of Industry, but reports directly to the Office of President. So it has high-level priority. And I'm happy to say that Australia has played a very useful role, a constructive role through AusAid in helping support the government in a big meeting of donors that occurred just this January past. It was the first Myanmar Development Cooperation Forum, and it raised a number of... it set out a framework for donors to cooperate, and as a sign of goodwill, there was a cancellation by the World Bank and the ADB of nearly $1 billion worth of debt, or some rescheduling at very low concessional rates. So I think there's a goodwill by donors, there's a seriousness by the government to try and coordinate the donors, but and Australia has played, as has DFID, the UK Development Agency, a very important role in supporting that donor coordination. There's still some major challenges. The challenges and the opportunities, just to summarise and conclude, the government needs to be able to say no to donors and business investors and set the pace it wants, because the pace is too fast at the moment. And the opportunity costs actually threaten to undermine the implementation of development plans. Secondly, for donors, there are a lot of donor principles that have been built up over the last decade or so around good donorship, but the key one is do no harm. And in that, there are a number of examples, but I'm sure you're all familiar with them from other contexts, but not poaching staff of government or NGOs to come in and work in donors. It's a common problem. Aligning the donor plans with the country development plans, so the plans that Sonanda Lin and her colleagues are working on. Doing a drivers of change analysis, which means, yes, donors should be working with the government to build its capacity at this time, but look at the role of civil society at the same time as both an antidote and an alternative sources of power that are emerging and developing in Burma that need to be supported also. There's a real threat, second last, that donors will abandon the Burmese refugee communities in Thailand, in China, in India and in Malaysia and move out too quickly. And there's actually not sufficient thought being given to their return. There's not demining that has occurred. There is no visible opportunities for economic employment, and so there's real risks there. Finally, in regards to supporting civil society and CSOs, and many of you work for universities and NGOs here, I suggest that it's critically important that the government, encouraging the Australian government to work with the Burmese government in reforming the registration laws for registration of Burmese civil society is very important. At the moment, a lot of Burmese organisations have to register as companies and then suffer 10% taxation, but it's very hard to register in Burma, and it's hard to receive foreign funds if you're a Burmese NGO or CBO. There's a great need for sharing of knowledge and skills and capacity building. And to that end, I commend the Australian Myanmar Institute for having this forum, but I urge it to set up and lobby universities to set up language training in Burmese language, because the more that we have a converse and are able to work in the Burmese language and the minority languages with Burmese colleagues, I think that bodes well for development in the future. Thank you. My time is up.